Welcome back to India Global Forum. Now we're taking a look at global leadership. What's happening behind the headlines? COVID, climate change, a US election. Fair to say that these three issues have oversaturated most people's attention over the last year. But what's been going on behind the scenes? We've seen global attention shifting to the Indo-Pacific and China. What kind of post-pandemic world are we moving into, and who will call the shots? So joining me now to discuss some of these issues, really delighted to welcome in person Tom Tugendhat, the chair of Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the United Kingdom, and also joining us virtually, very happy to have Ashok Malik, Policy Advisor, Ministry of External Affairs in India. Thanks very much for joining us both. So let's start, Tom, with you. Has the pandemic, do you think, altered the existing geopolitical trends? This tilt to the Indo-Pacific region.
Well, look, I think it's had very deep repercussions. I think we've all realised really what our supply chains look like in great detail. There's a few moments, of course, that have shaped that. One is the PPE struggle that many countries had right early on in March, and the second thing, of course, is the closure of the Suez Canal by that boat that went sideways, that evergreen boat that went sideways a number of months ago now. That we've all realised the interdependence, but also the supply chain issues that we all have, and I think that's been a wake-up call for a lot of people.
So let's hear from you, Ashok, as well. Do you think that question? What do you think about that question? Has the pandemic altered the existing geopolitical trends?
The pandemic did two things. One, it accentuated and sharpened existing trend lines that included deep concerns about the current model of globalization and the dependencies that international trading order had created. These were sharpened, as Tom said, in the early months of the pandemic, when there was this arms race almost for N95 masks and PPE kits and various basic pharmaceutical ingredients, because we found that we were locked into one or two sourcing geographies. And as the world rebuilds post-pandemic, it does need to diversify its sources of critical supplies. Some of these supplies will be made available from new production centers at home, some from trusted partners. But overall, the trend is towards a more diversified and a more reliable globalization, and certainly more diverse supply chains. So in that, Tom is absolutely right. That's exactly the concerns we share.
Let's talk, Tom, about this tilt to the Indo-Pacific region. Why this focus on the Pacific side rather than India?
Well, I think the focus on the Pacific has really been because the focus has been on China. And those of us who have been pushing for the tilt to be more towards the India element are actually trying to build on what Ashok was just talking about, which is that the reality is globalization isn't going away. And I don't think anybody wants the interdependence of nations, the partnership between nations to go away. But what we want a resilient globalization, and what we've had to date is a vulnerable one. Now, I think this is where India and Britain have already demonstrated in the last year, 2 years, the way in which we can partner. The Indian Serum Institute is a classic example of this, where the AstraZeneca vaccine has been made in India, demonstrating the capabilities and the partnership of both countries. And so I think this is where the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, which, as you rightly say, has been much more Pacific than Indo, needs to rebalance, and I think needs to focus very much more on the Indo element.
And so how would we do that?
Well, I think there's an awful lot we can do. And now, we've already had the initial discussion that Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Johnson began in the conversation that was supposed to be in person, but sadly ended up being online. I'm afraid we're all getting used to that now. But there's the beginning of the trade element there. But actually, this is all about the living bridge. And this is something that Prime Minister Modi has spoken about in the past. And when we published our report on our relationship with India in 2019, the Foreign Affairs Committee really argued for various elements in which we should be deepening that partnership, building that living bridge. And indeed, actually, if you'll excuse the analogy, like London Bridge, building homes and businesses on top of it.
So, Ashok, what would you say? How can we accelerate or continue to build this living bridge?
I'd just like to go back to the point about the Indo-Pacific. In India, we see the Indo-Pacific slightly differently from the way Tom described it, and we do hope to persuade our British friends to see it the way we do. If you look at India's geographical location, we have an eastern coast and a western coast, an east coast and a west coast, and we can't really separate the waters to our east and the west and say these are two different systems with a line in the water, as it were. Historically, our society, our economy, our prosperity has been a confluence of both the waters to our east and to our west. For us, the Indo-Pacific extends from Sydney to Somalia, or maybe sort of San Francisco to the eastern coast of Africa, if you will. I know that's a vast expanse of water. You can't have one strategy for this entire system. I appreciate that. You will have to have many. And we have many partners who work in different sub-regions of the Indo-Pacific. For example, with Britain, we could work in the Western Indian Ocean. We could work in the Gulf. With our Australian friends, we could work in, say, the Pacific Islands. We could also work with Indonesia, close to there. So the Indo-Pacific is more than just a small region or a narrow region to the east of India. It's much wider, and Britain, as the historic Indo-Pacific power in the real sense of the term, needs to appreciate that.
I think Ashok, you're absolutely right, and I think finding ways in which we work together is essential, and that's why I'd argue that we need to move away from simply looking at Taiwan or Japan or China as the Indo-Pacific, but actually looking, as you rightly say, at old alliances we've got, like the Five Parties Defence Agreement, or indeed building on what you're already doing with the Quad, with Australia, with Japan and the United States, and finding ways in which the United Kingdom can support the sort of democratic states, the free states in the region, of which India is quite significantly the largest and most important.
Can I get you both to respond to what we heard from President Xi? The Chinese people will never allow any foreign forces to bully, coerce, and enslave us, said to 70,000 of the party faithful just yesterday. Whoever attempts to do that will surely break their heads on the steel Great Wall, built with the blood and flesh of 1.4 billion Chinese people. Pretty striking words, Tom.
I'm afraid we've got used to wolf warrior diplomacy in recent years, and the Chinese ambassador to Sweden rather threateningly said that for our friends we have wine and flowers, and for our enemies we have shotguns. I mean, it's not exactly subtle. So I'm afraid we've got used to this rather, if you'll excuse the expression, macho language that we're seeing coming out of China at the moment. And I think that's a great shame, because China is one of the great civilizational powers, and it's absolutely right that China should have a real place in the way the world works, and help to shape decisions and help to shape the international treaties. But that means being a partner. That means building on positive relationships. That means defending the rules that have seen us all prosper, broadly speaking, in peace for the last 70, 80 years. So I hope very much that the attitude that we're seeing out of a rather belligerent Chinese Communist Party won't overwhelm the reality that actually 5,000 years of Chinese history points in one direction, maybe 100 years of communist history points in a different direction, but the reality is China is much more than just the Communist Party.
Ashok, do you have a response to President Xi's statement yesterday?
Look, we have watched Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy, which Tom referred to, with some interest and amusement in the past few months. And I'm always wary of Chinese language speeches or Mandarin speeches being translated into English by Chinese translators. They tend to sound more dramatic than is probably intended. But having said that, to go to the point of a rising China, and of course China's rise is welcome because it is a great power, it is going to cause some shifts in the global system, but quite frankly, some of the projects China and the initiatives China has taken into the international system are causing disquiet. For instance, many of its infrastructure projects, while ostensibly welcome, have created dependencies and are frankly unsustainable both economically and ecologically, and in terms of the cost to local society. We are seeing many of these projects in our neighborhood, and we are wondering what this is about. Second, of
Give us
course,
some
we
examples
have,
of those projects.
well, we've seen what's called the world's emptiest airport in Hambantota, which adjoins a port, which is called the world's emptiest port. Both spanking new projects, excellent infrastructure, but nothing justifies that sort of investment there. We aren't seeing the traffic. We are seeing the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is going through some territory that is actually legally Indian territory. And it's creating projects that don't seem to have much of an economic purpose. And we wonder if they are dual-use projects. We do have concerns about that. And separate from the Belt and Road Initiative, on our border last summer, completely out of nowhere, China amassed vast numbers of troops, in a manner it had never done in recent history. And that caused some concerns too, because that did affect other aspects of our relationship, including economic and trade aspects. So there are issues about Chinese actions in the past few years, especially the past year, that have caused some questions, and we're wondering where this is going.
So I wonder if we could move that question of China around to talk about technology a little bit, because there is a great concern that there are different internets being created. We saw the UK, together with the US and now Europe, rejecting the Huawei technology. It's resulted in some pretty interesting differences in how the world will access the internet. It's a pretty sensitive issue when it comes to security. I just wonder how you would look at that, Tom, in terms of how you want to engage with China. What is the right path forward to tread together while maintaining these national security aspects?
So look, I think, like everybody, we want to work with free people, we want to work with partners around the world, and we want to see everybody prosper in peace as much as possible. But it's really hard to do that with states that are using state capitalism and indeed then using state industry as means of seeking to achieve monopoly positions and the leverage that obtains. And that's why I think that we are beginning to see partnerships, and India also rejected Huawei, and we're seeing partnerships between countries that, if you like, obey the usual rules of commerce, the basic rules of trade, that actually do stick to their agreements in the WTO or in various other international fora. And sadly, we're seeing others. And I think Ashok quite rightly identified some of the issues where there are concerns in terms of infrastructure. And we know, as Ashok knows only too well, we know that one of the things that's really challenging us as well is the environmental threats of major Chinese infrastructure projects in terms of coal building and some coal power station building. So finding ways in which our technology can interact is a challenge, and it's going to remain a challenge if one side is a fundamentally statist power and the others, like our two countries, are free market open economies.
Ashok, did you want to comment on that from an Indian perspective?
This is about more than just telecom. There are a whole host of emerging technologies. We're only at the edge of this brave new world, if you will. Telecom, robotics, artificial intelligence, personalized medicine, all of these will require standard setting. It will require transparency and will require trust. So the question is, do you work with partners you trust? Do you work with a regime that is transparent and democratic and functions by the rules? And who defines these standards? These are questions that frankly, the democratic world is asking. We don't have answers yet, but we're beginning to ask these questions. And that is where I think India and the UK have a lot to contribute, individually and together, in terms of ensuring that the sort of norms that govern these emerging technologies, including the internet and telecom related technologies, are norms we are comfortable with and norms that conform to our principles and values. By our, I mean, of course, the democratic world.
I think Ashok's absolutely right on that, and actually a real opportunity, I think, for us both, and it is on some of these standard-setting bodies like the UN, bodies of the International Telecoms Union, and various other similar organisations that do set standards globally. One of the things that the partnership between India and the UK, but actually between others as well, Australia, France, Germany, United States, Canada, and many others besides, is making sure that we get democracies and rule of law states like our own onto these standard setting bodies, because if we don't, we end up having standards shaped by people whose views of freedom and self-association and so on are pretty fundamentally different to our own.
I want to turn to the cut in UK aid budget, because that has been, I think, bad news for a lot of countries around the world. I wonder if you could let me know, Tom, how you think, what kind of priorities might be being neglected as we do what we have to do, which is figure out how to pay for COVID-19.
Well, look, India has been a partner in aid for a number of years now. I think I'm right in saying, and Ashok, you'll correct me, but I think India produced 60 million doses of vaccine at the Serum Institute, which went abroad, which went overseas from India, and I think about 5 million or so doses were absolutely free, and the others were basically at cost. So it's an extraordinary act of generosity by the Indian people, and I think something that we all should learn from. And India has been a partner for British aid for a number of years, and I say that quite clearly because actually India has not been a recipient of British aid for many, many years. It's been a partner. We've done projects together. Yes, some of that money has been spent in India, but not on India, if you see. So it's where we've worked together. And I think this is where the UK has got some real opportunities. The way that we've supported various different operations and enterprises in Syria and Jordan and Lebanon and so on, or indeed in East and West Africa, to change the direction of girls' lives, or to change the direction of the threat of terrorism and so on, has been something that we've taken very seriously. So I am concerned about this cut, because as we both know, and Ashok just pointed out, for infrastructure building, if you step away from the table, you don't leave a vacuum. Somebody else steps in. And we have the choice, really. Do we want the influences shaping countries around the world to be leaning towards the free trade, open economies with democratic instincts and so on, or do we want them leaning the other way? And I think for both the Indian people and the British people, the interest is very much in trying to build up like-minded states and supporting like-minded and similar values interests.
How do you see that, Ashok, in terms of aid to areas of the world that need it more?
India is the country with the largest incremental developmental assistance budget currently, and as sort of we move into the future, because we provide assistance, we undertake projects in our neighborhood in South Asia, in the broader neighborhood in other parts of Asia, including Central Asia, and of course in Africa, across the continent of Africa. These are projects related to education, the digital medium, and IT, health, including digital health, skilling, infrastructure, and of course agriculture. And what is important about our projects is each of these projects represents a template that has worked at home. So it's we actually export or take to another country experiments or ideas or innovations that have actually worked for our people at home and make sense to similarly placed countries in other parts of the world. We have quite an expansive and diverse developmental assistance portfolio. And quite frankly, an India-UK developmental partnership for other countries is waiting to happen, is waiting to grow. It's already exists. In areas such as education, youth and skilling, health, because health is emerging as a very important currency of international diplomacy after COVID. And India and the UK are natural partners here because there are complementarities we can build on. Of course, the AstraZeneca serum partnership was one example. And there is much we can do together, especially in Africa, I would say in the Caribbean, in countries that are a part of the Commonwealth. We have to redefine the Commonwealth not just as a early 20th century club, but actually as a living 21st century developmental ecosystem where Britain and India contribute together.
I think Ashok's absolutely right. I have to say, it's always worth remembering that when you talk about the Commonwealth, half of the Commonwealth is India. So it's a very fundamental relationship. But I think building on that and building on a partnership globally is exactly what we should be doing.
I'm going to pass you both the crystal ball. How do you think the world is going to change? What are the trends that we're not seeing now that we're going to be talking about as, my goodness, didn't see that coming in a year's time, Tom?
Gosh, that's always tricky. Look, I mean, I think the fundamental trends that are going forward are going to continue, which is that democratic partnerships are going to deepen and get stronger. And so I'm a firm believer that actually the partnership between London and Delhi is only going to increase. I think one of the other things, though, that we're going to start being much more aware of is the challenges, the internal challenges within the Chinese system, and the consequential blowback that may have for the rest of us. So I think that's also going to push us closer and closer together.
Ashok, what about you? I'm passing you the crystal ball. What are the trends that are emerging as we're coming out of the pandemic or coming next through it?
Well, two immediate predictions. England wins the European Cup and
Glad to hear that.
India wins the Test series against England.
I'm not sure about
that. Apart from that, we are, quite frankly, this is a somber prognosis because we are moving from a predictable system, sort of a Lockean system, if you will, to a Hobbesian system. The world is going to get more competitive. There is more turbulence ahead. But that is where countries such as India and the UK, countries that share fundamental values, we don't always agree, and we will not always agree. But there's more we agree on than we disagree on. This is where we really have to work together to do three things. One, trade where we can, and we really can, build a strong trade partnership, which builds our complementarities. Come together for global good, climate change and health, and a reformed multilateral system. And, as I said earlier, standard setting and norms, especially for emerging technologies and the global commons. I'd like to stop there.
Thank you, Ashok. So is England going to win the Euros?
I'm sure England's going to win the Euros, but I also think that we're going to have a very good test series against India, and whoever wins, Ashok, buys the other one dinner. How's that?
Absolutely. The next time I'm in London or you're in Delhi.
Excellent.
Thank you to both Tom Tugendhat and to Ashok Malik.